So, what was your first reaction or feeling when you heard that Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, had been murdered on the streets of Manhattan?
I think I had the obligatory sense of horror at what looked like a targeted assassination, but the mystery was there from the get-go, too. I wanted to know who had done it and why.
Like Molly, my first thought was, well, this looks like a contract hit. This looks like a professional hit. People do not normally graduate from non-criminal existences to pre-planned, perfectly calm, serene murders on a day, in broad daylight on a city street, and then a perfectly planned escape that enables you to disappear. That was fascinating. And I think it says something about the moment we're living in and our forays into violence as a culture that somebody can be that methodical and sort of apparently calm about committing what is the most brutal act of violence you can commit.
Welcome to Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news that we can't stop thinking about. I'm David Von Drehle, Deputy Opinions Editor and columnist here at the Post, and this week we're talking about the now several weeks long obsession with the murder of a healthcare CEO in Midtown Manhattan, and about Luigi Mangione, the man suspected of committing the crime. And now I'm joined by two of my colleagues to talk through the issues that underlie this compelling story: the clear outrage over healthcare costs in America, but also the normalization of public violence and ideas of justice in the world today. So could each of you introduce yourselves?
I'm Molly Roberts. I'm an opinion writer at the Post.
And I'm Matt Bai. I'm a contributing columnist at the Post.
Welcome. Unfortunately, high-profile shootings are nothing unfamiliar in the United States of America, and yet this crime and this suspect has been particularly riveting. What is it about this one that has driven so much attention and discussion?
First of all, executives don't get gunned down every day on the streets of Manhattan. A manhunt is always interesting. It was interesting in the time of Lincoln, and it's interesting now.
I also think that the clear motive that was at first just imagined and then was made explicit in the handwritten note he had with him led a lot of people to follow it more closely, understand it better, for sure. Of course, we're living in a very violent time. We hear about mass shootings alarmingly frequently, but when that happens, it's rarely that the shooter has a reason for it that is, I don't want to say cogently, it's hard to talk about any of this because you don't want to sound like you're condoning it, but it's very rare that the shooter has a motive that he's able to weave into some tapestry of social injustice, and that's what Luigi Mangione did here, and what a lot of people, I think, bought into as they celebrated him online. Wrongly. I have to add the disclaimer, wrongly, but I do think that's what was so fascinating about it to a lot of people.
Can I jump in on that for a sec, David?
Yeah, for sure.
But I think this is where we fall down in looking at this a little bit is to assume that there is this rationale, that this motive makes sense. It makes sense to a lot of people because they've had difficult experiences with the healthcare system, which I get. But, as my doctor wrote to me, I love my doctor. He's really smart. He wrote to me right away and he said, how are all of you in the media treating this as a rationale? This is a psychotic break. He said, John Hinckley Jr. shot Ronald Reagan in 1981. This was him talking, and I think accurately. He said, he did it supposedly to impress an actress. And nobody looked at that and said, well, that's an interesting rationale. They looked at it and said, he's crazy. And in fact, he went to a mental health facility, not to a prison. He was deemed insane. We can't accept that. It's more rational or somehow makes him more cogent, to use that word, to say that he did it because of injustices in the healthcare system. First of all, it's not even clear to this point that he experienced any injustices in the healthcare system, but leaving that to the side, because we'll find out more. I think healthy people don't commit an act like this. They certainly don't commit it with this level of premeditation and serenity. So I think as a media are taking his manifesto as motive right? Like taking the Unabomber's manifesto that inspired him as motive is a breakdown in insensible coverage, because what you're really looking at is not a sane act. And it doesn't make it more sane just because the manifesto he wrote aligns with some people's beliefs about what's going on in the country. It is not a sane act.
Sure, I don't disagree with that. I want to be very clear about that. And that's part of why I said I didn't want to use the word cogently. I agree it's not a sane act. And it does seem to me like he was not in a good mental state. But the reason he articulated, regardless of whether it is reasonable and regardless of whether it is actually what motivated him, is something that people are able to understand and latch onto because they're angry at the healthcare system. I think it's misguided, just like you said, to just say, so it's understandable why he did it. But he tapped into something that people are feeling, and that's why they're fascinated by him.
Well, and I think it's fair to say, and we're all being careful in this conversation, but history would not suggest that all political violence is insane. There's just too much of it, and it's too defining in world history that if in fact this was some political gesture, then you could call it ineffective, you could call it random, you could call it disorganized. But I mean, we're not saying that Samuel Adams was insane, even though he advocated the killing of all sorts of officials in the cause of liberating the American colonies in the 18th century. What about the fact that it's caught on camera, that we watched the crime, we saw snippets of the getaway? Surely that's a factor as well. And then related to that, what about the, to me, not inconsiderable added fact that immediately, almost, we got a glimpse of his face and he turned out to be a good-looking young man and almost typecast as a kind of Batman almost.
Yeah, I think typecast is exactly the way to put it, because there is kind of a cinematic nature to all of this. We had exactly what we needed from the beginning. We had pictures of his face in the mask and then the picture of him kind of smiling. So you had the initial mystery of who is he, but we have just enough to go on to be engaged and to stay with it. We had the Monopoly money in the park. He was doing some of this too. He clearly wanted people to be following his trail the same way they would in a movie. And then ultimately you see him and he doesn't look totally dissimilar from someone who could be a movie star. So I think all of that absolutely plays into it. And he left so much for us on social media as well. There was just way more material than you get, and material that didn't only have to do specifically with the crime, but had to do with his whole life, his whole political outlook. So I think that we were able to see a narrative forming and kind of work on forming it ourselves, which is, I think, a common thing in the age of social media.
I mean, and I'm glad you raised this, David, about what he looks like, what he seems like, because I do think this plays a part in what I think is the sort of inappropriate, appropriation of him as like sort of almost a spokesman, right, for public dissatisfaction. I think if he were poor or clearly, had gone through years of mental institutions, or were someone who a lot of educated Americans couldn't identify with, right? He'd be a less perfect emblem. But I think a lot of people championed his, I don't know if they championed his cause, that's not fair, but found sympathy at least with his cause, in part because he's a prep school kid and an Ivy League kid, and he is good looking and he does look like someone you know. And so he can't be crazy or addled. He's clearly articulating a cerebral point of view. He clearly has a cerebral motivation, right? There is an identity with him among a lot of the commentators because they recognize in him the background. What's interesting is when you really look at the two protagonists here, if you want to call them that, right? I hesitate to storify it, but when you look at the shooter and the victim, the contrast is quite clear. It's the wealthy, chastised, caricatured healthcare executive who's from rural Iowa, whose father worked in a factory, who went to a public college, who worked his way up to where he is. And it's the very privileged country club owning prep school Ivy League kid who's articulating this great populist manifesto against the system. So it's not quite as neat as I think some people would like it to be.
Fascinating stuff, and I'm eager to dig into it some more. But first, we need to take a break. Welcome back. I'm David Von Drehle, and you're listening to Impromptu from the Washington Post opinion section. So much of the response to this murder has unfolded online, in social media. And one of the striking facts is, if we need another example this year of the decline of the control that legacy media has over the conversation, I think all of us in the business had sort of coalesced in the age of school shootings and mass shootings around the idea that we wanted to bring less glamour, less attention to killers, because we came to believe that the narcissistic personality was drawn to this kind of a crime. In this case, from the very beginning, the horse was out of the barn long before we could even think about trying to close the barn door. Is this a new phenomenon where social media is going to decide, people are going to decide for themselves which criminals they decide to glorify and celebrate?
The answer to your question is yes. I mean, it was always a nice aspiration, the idea that the media could somehow exert some control over what kind of attention or glamour a violent criminal got. But in the social media age, it's essentially the conversation has passed us by. There's social media where people can discuss it themselves. There's video they can watch. There's, minute by minute updates. As with so many other things, we don't get to decide anymore what gets attention or what's important. We only get to decide how much perspective we can bring to bear on it.
That seems basically right to me. I suppose up until now, we just didn't have a handsome enough shooter, but people were making Luigi Mangione's face the avatar of their group chats long before the New York Times or Washington Post or anyone else decided to do write-ups of him with that face attached to them. I suppose you could argue that there are some people who aren't as caught up in that social media narrative, and so maybe traditional media could stem the flow of Luigi fandom, but I'm not so sure how far that would go.
Yeah, I mean, there were already a lot of social media commentary, and then the memes and T-shirts and merchandise for sale online. It's remarkable how quickly this could happen. And then we learned, from Mangione's own social media accounts that he was young, active on social media, and probably had a pretty clear idea that this might be exactly what would happen. One wonders if he wanted to be caught or if he wanted to get away with this. Any thoughts?
It's so hard to say. That's one of the things I've been wondering about myself, and I've been talking to friends about, which also just shows that I think he did a pretty good job making people, to the extent he was aware he was doing it, making people stay invested. The fact that he had his notebook with him, that he had the handwritten note, suggests that he at least contemplated the possibility that he would be caught. And he could have left the country, presumably. He didn't seem to try to. On the other hand, then why bother taking all those Greyhound buses to Altoona? So I don't know. It makes me wonder whether he wasn't even sure what he wanted and he kind of prepared for both eventualities.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I obviously have no idea what was in his head, but I think if I were investigating the crime and you have somebody who went to great lengths to escape, actually did a really good job evading law enforcement for as long as he did, and had this manifesto and this, what to him felt like a rationale, I would assume that he at least contemplated killing more people. I mean, I would assume that this may not have been the only CEO on his list. And who knows where he would have gone next, because he clearly intended to escape and get away. But it would not surprise me at all if that were, in his mind, only the first victim, provided he could get away.
That's fair. The manifesto does say these parasites, plural, had it coming.
Around the same time as this crime, a jury in same New York City acquitted Daniel Penny of homicide in the case of his choking a schizophrenic homeless person to death on a New York subway car. Penny said that he felt that the man was menacing the other passengers and that he needed to take action to protect them. Penny is a hero of the online right now and even attended a football game with President-elect Trump. Are we in danger of normalizing vigilante violence in the United States?
Yes, I think is the clearest answer to the question. But I also think that these two cases read together expose inconsistency, hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it, on both sides. You have people on the online left celebrating Mangione, but they're furious about what Daniel Penny did. And then you have people on the online right who are celebrating Daniel Penny and they're furious about what Mangione did. And of course, there's a more nuanced way of looking at this that could maybe explain why you feel one way about the Daniel Penny case and you feel a different way about the Luigi Mangione case. But most people really aren't bothering. They're just going with whatever kind of fits their broad-based political perspectives.
Yeah, I guess I don't think we're in danger of normalizing violence as a acceptable means of resolving political disputes. I think we're there, and I think we've been heading there for a while. And I wish I didn't think that. Because I can go as far back. I remember when Representative Giffords was shot in Arizona, and a lot of us wrote, is this the future? Is this something we can head off? Right? Are we in for another round of political violence? I mean, the 1960s was rife with people getting shot. Donald Trump was shot at this past summer. I mean, look, I don't see any way that we don't see more of it, particularly when political leaders are talking about it as if it's normal or as if it's excusable. Trump taking a guy who's just been acquitted of murder to a football game. Elizabeth Warren saying violence is never acceptable, but, if you push people far enough. I mean, we are talking about violence as if there were circumstances in which if it was not excusable, then it's least understandable. And when you get to that place, you have created a space for it in the society that's acceptable and in some cases celebrated.
Catherine Rampell in the Post opinion section wrote today that this is the populist moment, that people are not interested in solutions to problems. They're interested in retribution or revenge or, if you push people far enough, this is what you're going to get kind of attitudes to our politics. And that's discouraging. And we see that it can have particularly dangerous effects arguably on young men. The last sort of thing that I think about this when I look is just how troubled the passage from adolescence to adulthood is for so many men. I have to think that Luigi Mangione's parents felt they'd done a pretty good job once they had their valedictorian son go get his master's degree from Penn, and they probably thought they were all done with their parenting. And the next thing they know, he's arrested at McDonald's and in jail for murder, and probably going to be there for the rest of his life or most of it. That, as speaking as a parent, I guess I always come around to having my heart break for the people who watch things go so desperately wrong. Any final thoughts? Or they probably won't be final. We could well be talking about this again, because I bet it's going to be the next trial of the century for New York City.
No, I think every part of the story is just that, heartbreaking, and it's hard to think of anything much to add.
One of the things that really struck me as a hypocrisy in this moment, and I think particularly for the left and particularly and in the media too, if I'm being honest, is the fact that the first question everybody always asks in a high-profile shooting like this is, where to get the gun? Where's the gun from? If there's too many guns in the country, they go immediately to gun control, which I, understand and sympathize with increasingly as the years go on. But in this case, you have a gun, printed from a 3D printer that basically anybody with some technical proficiency can make, with loopholes in the law. And all the talk was about healthcare. And, is healthcare push people too far? And is healthcare, look at what we have in this country and look at the crisis. I mean, yes, we have apocalyptic rhetoric in this country. It will lead to violence. That was predictable. You didn't have to be a genius to see that this was going to be an incoming, an ongoing and building problem. But let's be fair. We should look at where these ghost guns are from. It's not right to blame the weapons for every other kind of crime until the crime seems to have some political resonance, and then suddenly that's not an issue. Is it an issue or isn't it? I think that's one of the things we have to grapple with as collective media.
And of course, having expressed that sympathy for the Mangione parents, I want to say that our feelings go out as well to Mr. Thompson's widow and 2 young children. These crimes can seem like movies or TV scripts as they play out on our phones and on our screens. They leave real damage in the world. Well, let's wrap it up on that note. Thank you very much, Molly Roberts and Matt Bai, for a great conversation about a tragic phenomenon.
Nice to see you all.
It was good to talk with both of you, even if it was about a depressing and distressing subject.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Damir Maruzik, Chris Sulentrop, and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Chris Rucan designed our art. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. We're always eager to hear your take on these topics. Email us at impromptu@washpost.com with your thoughts, and we will promise to read them. If you're enjoying the show, please don't forget to follow us and rate us on your favorite podcast app.